What branch of service were you in?
I was in the U.S. Air Force. I was on active duty for about 7 years, and then I was in the reserves for a couple years after that.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I was actually neither. Well, enlist in a way. I wanted to go in the Air Force when I was in high school, and I wanted to go through ROTC and go to college, so I went through Air Force ROTC at University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and then I got my degree and completed the ROTC program and my degree at the same time, and got commissioned as a second lieutenant, and that's when I entered the Air Force.
Why did you join?
I wanted to join just because I was wanting to serve my country. I was interested in the Air Force. I liked airplanes, jets, and fighters, and that sort of thing. My dad had been in the Army for a couple of years, and we weren't necessarily a big military family, but there was always kind of that background, and I'd always been interested in the military, so it just felt like something that I really wanted to do. And when I was about a junior in high school, I really firmed up in my mind that that's what I wanted to do.
Why did you pick the service branch you joined?
Well, mostly just because I liked airplanes. I mean, I like the other aspects of the military, but I liked the airplanes, and I wanted to go into engineering, and I knew the Air Force was really big into engineering. They had a lot of opportunities in research and development and all sorts of different things, and in my mind I thought I'd be designing airplanes, which you don't really do on active duty, but that was kind of the direction I was going. So I was also interested a little bit in the Navy, but I primarily was interested in the Air Force.
How old were you?
Well, I joined ROTC when I was a freshman in college, so I was, I think, 18 at the time, and then when I completed college and got my degree and first went on active duty, I was 23. So,
do you recall your first days in service?
Yes, well, a little bit, yeah. I remember on active duty, my first duty station was at Hill Air Force Base in Ogden, Utah, and I had to report out there from here in Nebraska, so I drove out there with my vehicle, and it was the middle of irrigating season, so my dad couldn't go, but my mom took a van with a few other things. I wasn't like a lot of these guys that reported to active duty and they went through basic training and then they're immediately into some advanced training where they're living in barracks. I was an officer, and because I was not married, I had to live off base. So I found an apartment just like your average person does, and so that was different than a lot of guys' experiences. But yeah, my first few days, it wasn't because I'd already gone through field training in college, which is kind of like basic training. I didn't have to report in and get yelled at by a drill sergeant, and didn't have to run around trying to figure things out. I'd already been through ROTC, so I knew how to wear the uniform. I knew, what to do, so it wasn't all totally new, but there was lots of in-processing, lots of forms to fill out, and lots of briefings and all sorts of very unexciting things. But it wasn't the stressful kind of thing that a lot of guys experience that have been drafted or enlist in their first experiences, getting yelled at by a drill sergeant. So,
tell me about your training experiences.
Well, we had a thing called field training. It was 4 weeks, and it was in the summer between my sophomore and junior year of college. Some people go through ROTC in 2 years, and some do it 4 years. If you do 2 years, all the stuff is just compressed and you have to take more classes. But I did the 4-year route. That's what most people do. But then I had to go down to Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, and I was down there for 4 weeks in July of 1991. And that was a lot like basic training, getting you up at 4:30 or 5 in the morning, yelling at you. You have 3 minutes to get dressed and get cleaned up and report outside for PT, and then you'd run downstairs and line up outside to do PT and push-ups and sit-ups and running around and all sorts of stuff, and then you'd have to go back upstairs and have like 4 minutes to change in your uniform, and you'd rush off to breakfast, and we had 4 minutes to eat our meals, so you'd eat very quickly, and then you'd be back out the door or go off to some training classes or something like that, and then you'd go off and eat lunch, and then usually change back into your PT stuff for some more PT, and then you change back to your uniform so it was just a lot of going here and there and yelling at you, and so it was stressful. But because I'd been in our OTC, we had been taught how to wear the uniform. We had been doing physical training, so most of the people were in shape and kind of knew what was going on. Some of them weren't as much as they should have, considering they'd been in it for 2 years already. But it's a little different than these people that, basic training that just show up and they don't have any clue of what to do. So, but it was hard, and they put a lot of stress on you. A lot of it's mental, seeing how you'll react to the mental aspect of it, and so a lot of it's kind of in your head, but it was still difficult. But I think most people made it through. I only think, I don't remember how many people were in our encampment. There were probably, 250, 300, and maybe 10 to 15 quit. So it's not like a Navy SEALs thing where 3/4 of the people wash out. So
how did you get through it?
Oh, it's just basically one day at a time. Get up in the morning, get your get your PTs on, go to PT, get through that. I was in good shape, so physically, it wasn't too difficult for me. You're very tired at the end of the day, but it was manageable. But it's just kind of one of those things. Get through one day. The best part of the day was about 9:30, called the quarters. We had about half an hour, 45 minutes, something like that, where our instructors couldn't bother us, and we had a few minutes to, if we needed to shower or something really quick, we could, or that was the time to wash our clothes or write a letter home or something like that, or work on our memorize our stuff. I couldn't find it. I've got a book. I had a little blue book about this big that we had to carry everywhere with us, and you'd get in big trouble if you didn't carry your book, and that had all sorts of different Air Force history and poems and different things that we were supposed to memorize. And if you were standing in line and you were waiting for something, you were expected to get your book out and get it out, and there's a prescribed way to stand there with your feet apart and the book right in front of your face, about a foot in front of you, and you're supposed to stand there and read it. So at the end of the day, you might be needing to read stuff out of that book to memorize, because they'd ask you questions, and if you didn't have it memorized, they'd yell at you, and then they'd give you hits, and they weren't hitting you. HIT stood for high intensity training, so it was basically you'd have to go and do extra physical training, and if you got enough of it, you had to go out on Sunday afternoon and do that, or you had to go and walk it off. They had these tours where you had to just basically walk around in the parking lot until you worked off all of your extra hits if you had too many of them. And I rarely had to do that because I usually had my act together, but there was always exceptions to that. So,
what type of work did you do while you were in the service?
Well, I went to college, and my degree was in mechanical engineering, and so the Air Force doesn't always use exactly what your degree was in, but in my case, they needed lots of engineers for lots of different positions, technical field. You weren't necessarily doing engineering work all the time, but they needed somebody with a technical background in those fields. So my first duty assignment, I was a reliability and maintainability engineer on explosive components for some missile systems. We mostly just think about the warhead on a missile that blows up or explodes, but there's rocket motors that fire. There's little fuses that are supposed to burn, which is supposed to start the whole process going. There's batteries that run the electrical systems and the onboard computers. So all that stuff has to run, and so we did testing of different components to make sure they work properly. A lot of our missiles will sit in a storage facility for years, and you may not pull them out until it's time to be used, and because once you use a missile, you can't use it again. It's blown up into little pieces. And so So a lot of that stuff will sit in storage, so you have to do tests on these things to make sure they still work without blowing them up, and so we did things like that. And then there was about halfway through my first duty assignment, there was a need for an engineer in another section in my same division, if you want to call it that. And so I got moved over there, and I became the engineer for external fuel tanks for the Air Force. So that the fuel tanks that hang underneath an airplane, I should have brought pictures of that, but any fuel tank that hangs off of an airplane, or even helicopters. We had helicopters that would have external fuel tanks. We did engineering support on those, so we wrote tests for doing various testing of tanks. And we had a couple cases where one of our bases in at Cannon Air Force Base in Clovis, New Mexico, they had a bunch of F-16s, and they had some fuel tanks had been damaged. And so I went down there to take a look at them and see if something could be done to them to be used. And so I looked at them and wrote up some procedures for some minor repairs to those. And so we did different things like that. And then once that assignment was over, as an officer, you have about 3 years at each duty assignment, and then you have to move on. They don't want you to stay super long as an officer in one area, because they had this mentality or this focus that everyone was going to be a colonel or a general someday, and so everything was geared towards giving each officer, I always called it not very much depth in experience, but a lot of breadth of experience. And so because they wanted them to experience a lot of different things, so when they become a commander, they've done a lot of things so they could identify in a lot of different areas. Enlisted, they wanted more depth and not quite so much breadth. So you had enlisted doing certain things really well over longer periods of time. Officers, not as deep, but more things. And so I moved after about the first 3 years, and I went to an 20th Intelligence Squadron at Offutt Air Force Base in Bellevue, Nebraska. And I wasn't an intel officer, but I was an engineer in their intel squadron, and I did route planning for crews, bomber crews. They would do a lot of hypothetical planning.
Where did you serve?
Well, I guess I kind of mentioned that already on my last question, but I served in 3 duty locations. First one was Hill Air Force Base in Utah. It was north of Salt Lake City, south of Ogden, and I was there for a little over 3 years, from 1994 to 1997, and then I went to Offutt Air Force Base, where I was in the 20th Intelligence Squadron, and I was only there for a little less than a year. I was there from the end of 1997 through halfway through 1998. And then my last duty assignment was at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln for Air Force ROTC, and I was there from 1998 through 2001. And that's not a normal duty assignment, and as there's not a base there, so all of our administrative paperwork and all that other stuff, we had to go back to Offutt because that was the closest military base. But we didn't have much interaction with the people at Offutt, so it was kind of anytime you're on an ROTC assignment, it's kind of unique because you're usually just with the other officers and enlisted that are there, so you've got 4 or 5 different military people that you are with, and then the rest of the people are students and civilians. So.
Did you serve during a war?
No, I did not. I was in college when Desert Storm, the Desert Storm happened, because that happened in 1991, I think. So that happened, and I was sophomore or junior in ROTC during that, so we paid attention to it. It was a big deal, of course, because, I mean, that was pretty serious, but it was a very short duration thing. And that was over well before I came on active duty, and so I was on active duty, and as an engineer, I wasn't a combat engineer. I was, kind of more research or kind of engineer in a way. So I was never in a position where I would be near combat. There was my first duty assignment at Hill Air Force Base. I did, after I got there, become trained to be an aircraft battle damage repair engineer, which sounds really fancy, but basically what that involved was if we would have been in a conflict where a lot of our planes were getting damaged, and we would have to send a team over to the forward operating location where those planes operated out of. And then we'd have a team of like 20 people, and as the officer, I wasn't in charge of the team. I was the engineer on the team. The rest of the people would do inspections of the aircraft and find the damage. And then they had a book that was about this thick, and it was kind of like a cookbook in a way. And they'd have to find what kind of damage they had in the book, and the book would tell them if the hole was a certain size or if something's torn off, this is what you can do. And then if it's a bigger hole, you put a bigger patch on it, whatever. And then if it was too big, then they'd come to me and ask me what needed to be done, and I would take a look at it, and I'd make a determination if it could be repaired or not, and then if it could, then I'd tell them what to do. Anyway, so that was conceivably, it could be near combat, but fortunately we're never in a conflict where that happened, where we're getting a lot of planes shot up, so never had to deploy, which I'm thankful for. But we were trained for that, so we had to do some training that simulated chemical attacks, so we'd have to wear chemical warfare gear and get in the bunker and that sort of thing. But I mean, that was all simulated, it wasn't real. And so no, I was never in combat. The Air Force, you know, there aren't a lot of people that typically are in combat unless you're a pilot that's dropping bombs, or you could be in a combat zone. But since I was in after Desert Storm was over, I was in a time of relative peace. There was a little bit of conflict going on in Europe, but nothing major, at least from the standpoint of the Air Force having a lot of people need to be in an area. So, and then I got out in 2001, right before 9/11, and so then a year later, you know, we really ramped up operations in Afghanistan and then Iraq, but I was out by then, so. No, I did not serve in combat, and I was never near it. So,
tell me about a couple of your most memorable experiences.
Well, there's a few. One of the things I got to do before I was even on active duty, and I was trying to find the picture and I couldn't find it, but one of the things that was really neat was when I was the summer after field training. The field training is a thing like basic training. They had some programs for people that were between their junior and senior year of college, and you could apply for those, and if you got accepted, you could do them. And one of them was called Advanced Field Training, but it wasn't anything like the previous year. You don't get yelled at. You got to actually stay in visiting officer quarters, and you didn't have to get up at 4:30. You could get up at 6:30, and you got to eat your meals in leisure. And what they did was you were there for like 10 days, and you went to different parts of an active Air Force base and saw different parts of it in different roles. So we got to go up in the control tower. We actually got to sit in the one of the fire trucks that they'd go out on the line if there was a crash and they had to do it. We actually got to shoot the water cannon out there in between the runways, and we got to sit in on an OSI briefing, which is Office of Special Investigations. It's kind of like that TV show, was it NCIS? It's the Air Force's equivalent. So that was kind of cool, kind of interesting, and we did a few other things. But the coolest part by far was before we went down, I was at our detachment, and we got a call from one of the officers that was setting up the whole thing. And he's calling to ask me if I'd be interested in an F-16 ride. He said, we're trying to line these up. Would you be interested in an F-16 ride? I'm like, yes, sir. Of course. So we actually were able to. So one of the guys in our group didn't want to do it. I have no idea why, but to this day I still can't believe he passed up the opportunity to ride an F-16. Because most of us weren't pilots. You know, you think of the Air Force, you think most people are pilots. Well, it's actually a small percentage that are pilots. So very few people have the opportunity to do something like that. So I jumped at the chance. And so we had to go through a little bit of training for a couple hours beforehand. They showed us how to wear a G suit, and they showed us if we had to eject from an airplane, how to do that. And we never ejected, obviously, but we had to get fitted for a helmet and parachute and all this other stuff. And so that was cool. But then we got to go out and get in the airplane, and you know, you're wearing a G suit and a parachute and a helmet, and you look just like the pilots. And so we were flying in an F-16 D, which is a two-seater. And so the pilot sat in the front and I sat in the back, and they had controls there, but I wasn't allowed to touch them for obvious reasons. But yeah, so we got to fly, and we did an afterburner takeoff off the runway. And if you've ever been on a roller coaster, it's like that times 10. It's just awesome. And then we were supposed to do aerial maneuvers, but the base commander was in our flight of 4, and he had some problems with his airplane, and so we took off later than we were supposed to, so we missed our aerial dogfighting thing, which I was kind of bummed about, but I probably would have blown chunks. So it's probably a good thing that we missed it, because that would have, I'm not sure if I would have been ready for that, but that would have been really cool. But then we went to the bombing range, and there's a bombing, this is down in Florida, there's a bombing range about 100 miles inland where they could drop not live ordnance, but dummy bombs. And we made 7 or 8 bomb passes, and they drop a dummy bomb, and I couldn't see what's going on. All of a sudden, we're just flying around, all of a sudden we dive down, and then all of a sudden we're pulling back up really hard. And we didn't pull lots of G's, but I think we pulled about 5 or 6 G's for a short duration for each one of those runs. So it's hard on you if you're not used to it. It wears you out. And then the very last run, I didn't know what was coming. All of a sudden, the whole plane shook, and very violently. And I was kind of like, oh, what's going on? And so we had a microphone in our helmet, and it was a hot mic. It wasn't on all the time, but you could push a button and talk to the pilot. And so I said, sir, what was that? And he said, oh, that was just a machine gun. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, I knew that, yeah. And he had actually told me I'd be able to take the stick on the way home for a little bit, but apparently when they were doing the machine gun pass, a hatch or a door access panel on the side of the plane had popped open, and so he wasn't comfortable letting me have the plane. And I'm like, that's fine. It would have been cool, but it was a really cool experience that obviously I've never been able to do again, but that was pretty amazing. Another very interesting thing that I did was my first assignment when I was in Utah. I was working on supporting different missile systems, and one of our missile systems, interestingly, was manufactured by a company in Israel. We had this missile need for a standoff missile, meaning a missile that you could fire from, the range was classified, but you know, more than 5 miles, but not like hundreds and hundreds of miles. And so we didn't have this capability in our inventory, and we were trying to develop a missile for that, but in the meantime we had this gap in our capability. And so this company in Israel had this missile that they'd produced that we could purchase, and interestingly, it was a missile that we would fly off of a B-52, because the tail area was so large it couldn't fit on our fighters. It would tear off a wing if you tried to fire it off of a fighter, which obviously is not good. So they mounted on B-52s. But anyway, I did some support on that, and they would have kind of like business meetings or status meetings about twice a year. And once a year it would be in Florida, and the people from Israel would come over to Florida or to Utah, but then about once a year we would go over to Israel. And so I only got to go once, but I went to Israel as part of that, and we were there for about a week for various meetings. And then one of the days on a Saturday or Sunday we got a day off, and so we went into Jerusalem, which is, you know, very old historic place, and where the Jewish temple was, and where Jesus was crucified. And so it was a very historic place. So we went there, and one of the interesting things, and I have a picture here, we weren't allowed to take our uniforms. even though we were in a place that was friendly to Americans, it was still something they're very sensitive about having a uniform military presence in another country. So we weren't allowed to wear uniforms. We didn't even take them. So everything we did, we were in civilian clothes, which was kind of different, but that's fine. But the time we went into the old city, which is the old part of Jerusalem, we went in there, and there was lots of security, Israeli security there, because they were really close to other countries that didn't like them, and so they had lots of patrols that were walking around. And in Israel, you have to serve for 2 years right out of high school. So there's a lot of 18, 19-year-olds doing various things. Anyway, we were walking through the city, and I saw this, what looked like to be a 14-year-old kid that was on patrol with some other people, and he had a machine gun on one side and a rocket launcher on the other side. And I asked if I could have my picture taken with him, and they said sure. So I did, and so I don't know if you can see that very well in the camera, but that was him. I thought I was young, but I looked like I was twice as old as this kid was, and he was probably, like I said, 18 or 19, but he looked like he never shaved, and it was pretty amazing. Kind of what we take for granted here. We're very safe, but there you're just minutes away from people that wanted you dead. So that was a very interesting experience.
Yeah. Were you awarded any medals or citations?
I was. I hopefully I can find them and bring them for later, but I didn't have any for any combat experience or anything like that because I wasn't in combat. So I received several. There's several awards you get just basically for being in the military. You had the Defense Service or Medal, I forget exactly what it's called, but basically anyone that's in the military gets that. And then I had a few others. I qualified marksman on the M9 9mm handgun. So I had a ribbon for that. Trying to remember all the others. There's a few. If you went through the equivalent of basic training and field training, you got the basic training ribbon. And then there are a couple others. If you do something not extraordinary, but something that's above and beyond, you can get extra medals. And there was a couple things that I did. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was for. There were some kind of short notice things that I had to help with on some projects that were pretty serious, and I got an achievement medal for a couple of those. And then at the end of a tour, you usually get a medal if you've done, or a duty assignment. You can get a medal if you've done a good job. And so my duty assignment after my 3 years at OFF and then my 3 years at ROTC, I got an Air Force Commendation Medal for those. So nothing really above and beyond, but your typical kinds of things for basically doing a good job.
How did you get promoted?
Well, in the Air Force, at least as officers, the first couple promotion levels, basically, I joke, but I've talked to you about this before, you have to have a pulse, and you have to have not screwed up so bad they can't promote you. So the first two officer promotions are basically time and grade, meaning you serve 2 years in grade as a second lieutenant, and as long as you've done everything you're supposed to do and you haven't done anything really wrong, and you fulfilled all of your obligations. I mean, there are conceivably people that hadn't done anything wrong, but they were just really lazy or whatever. You could possibly not get promoted, but the promotion rate's pretty high for those first two. So basically, each year you have a thing called an OPR, an Officer Performance Report, that your boss would fill out on you. And they basically do an evaluation of you, and then at the bottom it always have a recommendation whether to promote or not. And so if you had a do not promote at the bottom of that OPR, that's pretty bad. But I didn't, and most people don't. So I was promoted after about 2 years time and grade from second lieutenant to first lieutenant, and then 2 years after that from first lieutenant to captain. And then you serve in captain for about 7 years. I was only a captain for about three and a half years before I decided to get out, so I never met before a major board, but the major promotion to the rank of major is the first one in the Air Force for officers where it's competitive. Well, it used to be. Now, just recently they changed it so it's similar to lieutenant to captain. Basically, it's time and grade, and if you've done a good job, you get promoted. And it's back then there was only a certain percent could get promoted to major. Now, conceivably, everyone could if you've done a good job. But back then, you could do a good job and be a good officer and still not get promoted. So, but I never got to that point. So.
What was your highest rank you achieved here?
Captain, which is 03. So that's the same as a captain in the Marines, and in the Army and the Navy it would be a lieutenant. So.
How did you stay in touch with your family?
Well, because I was an officer, it was different. Once I was on active duty, I lived in an apartment off base. I had a telephone. I could call home if I wanted to. This was before email and texting, but I could call home and talk to them. The only time where I couldn't really talk to them was that 4-week period at field training when I was in college that summer. During that time, you weren't allowed contact with your families because they wanted you to be focused on your training. We were allowed one phone call during that 4 weeks, and you could take it basically at any time. So a lot of people kind of waited till halfway through to call home, and you could talk for like 15 minutes, whatever. I unfortunately had to use mine the first day, and that was because somebody at the airport or somewhere along the way had stolen some of my stuff out of my luggage, and I didn't know it till I got there and took everything out and was going to put stuff away. We were supposed to take a pair of running shoes and a pair of cross-training shoes in addition to all of our uniform stuff, and when I got there I found out that both my pairs of shoes had been stolen, and a pair of BDU pants, which is camo pants. BDU is battle dress uniform. So I told my officer in charge of my flight about it, and he didn't believe me. He thought I'd left it at home. So I had to use my one call the first day I was there to call home to verify what I already knew, that I had not left that stuff at home, because I was very type A about that sort of thing. I would not have left that stuff at home. So yeah, I got to call home and say, "Hey Mom, did I leave this stuff at home?" And she's like, "Why are you calling?" "Well, because it was stolen." And, "Well, no, you didn't leave it here." I'm like, "Okay, thanks. I gotta go. Love you. See you in 4 weeks. Bye." So that was it for about 4 weeks. But they still got to send us press clippings, or I was a big Kansas City Royals fan, so my parents would cut out the box scores from the games in the newspaper and send it with me. And so, but that was really the only time where I couldn't communicate with my family, so it wasn't bad at all.
What was the food like?
Well, again, I was an officer, and so I was not in mess halls normally. If I went on TDY, which is temporary duty, where I go to another base, I'd occasionally eat in the mess halls, but usually I wasn't even allowed to do that. I had to eat just off base, whatever. We weren't authorized to eat in the mess hall. I suppose I could have eaten there and paid, but I didn't want to pay money to eat in the mess hall. I'd pay my money to go somewhere else. But a few times when I was on temporary duty, squadron officer school, or another thing, I was down in Alabama once for 3 weeks, another time for 4 weeks. We'd eat in the chow hall, but it was good food. It wasn't great, but I always found something I liked. I'm not a super picky eater, but there was always decent food. At field training, I don't remember the food too much. We had 4 minutes to eat, and that sounds terrible, but we always had, from the moment we sat down to the moment we got up, we had 4 minutes. So, and we weren't allowed to talk, we weren't allowed to look around and do anything except eat. It's surprising how much food you can put away in 4 minutes if all you do is just eat. So, but I don't remember the food much there. It wasn't anything special, but it was fine. The only thing I really remember was every Friday we were in San Antonio, and there's a heavy Mexican presence, if you will. And so Friday was always Mexican Day, And I don't remember exactly what we had, but it was always really good. They had enchiladas or something like that, and Spanish rice or something, and I forget exactly what it was, but it was really good. It smelled good. And yeah, so that was always nice. I always wanted seconds, but there was never enough time.
Did you feel pressure or stress?
Well, most of the time, again, my situation was different than some of these guys, and so as an officer, you felt pressure, stress just to do a good job in your normal business, but it wasn't a situation where you're getting shot at or you have someone yelling at you all the time. The only time where it was really stressful was, again, during field training, and a lot of that psychological. They're trying to stress you to see how you'll react because they don't want people, especially as officers, to be people that can't handle stress. They don't want people that will buckle under pressure, and so they tried to put you in stressful situations to see how you'd react. But it was never any live fire types of things or anything like that. It's just yelling at you and trying to get you short of sleep and kind of hungry and tired and out of sorts to see how you'd react to that sort of situation. So, I handled it okay. Most people did, but we were never put in a position that was so hard to deal with that, it was impossible. They always went up to a certain point but didn't go too far. But that was the only time where it was really, really stressful. There are a few times when I was on active duty where we did exercises and all that where they had simulated chemical attacks, and you'd have to wear your full chemical warfare and be in situations. And it wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't super stressful because, again, we knew it was an exercise. Had I been a real situation, it might have been different. But it's always easy to stay calm, cool, and collected when you know what they're saying isn't really happening. So I don't know what it would have been like if I had really been in a live fire situation, but I'm fortunate and thankful that I never had to. So,
yeah. How did people entertain themselves?
Well, again, I worked almost like most people. I worked a normal day, 7 to 5, whatever. And so when I was done with my day, I'd go home and change and watch TV or do other things. And so it wasn't a situation where I was in barracks or dorms and had living with, hundreds of other people and all together. So there are times, a few times where we were doing mobility training and all that, we'd have to be in a room and you have to sit and wait for hours till your next thing, and they'd occasionally have a movie up and you'd watch movies or things like that. But it was before smartphones, so you couldn't look at your phone. Nobody had phones yet, so sometimes you're just sitting around and waiting for long periods with nothing to do, but you just sat there. So.
What did you do on leave?
Well, most of the time I would come home. I usually save up my leave. It sounds crazy, but we'd have 30 days of leave per year, which sounds like a huge amount. That's basically a month, which it is. But the way leave is considered in the Air Force or in the military, it's not as much. Basically, any time you were away from your duty assignment, you had to count those days of leave, even if it was a weekend. And so I still remember one time I was gone over like a Christmas break. We had several days off for Christmas where we weren't required to be at work because it was a Christmas and New Year's holiday. I still remember I went back, this was in Utah, I went back, drove back home for Christmas and New Year's. I was gone, I think, like 9 days, but I only missed 3 days of work, but I had to take 9 days of leave. So I only missed 3 days, but I counted as 9 just because I was away from my duty location for those 9 days. So all those had to count. So that kind of stunk, but you're getting 30 days, so it's kind of hard to argue. So you always tried to work it so you would a lot of people would just take local leave so they wouldn't be out of the duty area. If you were close enough while you're taking leave, you wouldn't have to count your off-duty days as leave. And so sometimes you try to take a vacation or a leave around a weekend and you'd start in the local area, but then you'd leave, but then you'd be back in the local area over the weekend, so you wouldn't have to count them. But I really enjoyed skiing, and so one of the things for my first duty assignment, I did a lot of skiing, and a lot of the people that were out there liked to ski, and so me and some other officers would often go skiing on the weekends when we didn't have to work. But sometimes if there was a lot of snow that was forecast, or a lot of snow had fallen the day before, if I didn't have a lot of work, the next day I'd call my boss and say, "Hey sir, can I take tomorrow off? I want to go skiing." And sometimes I'd be able to. So it was always I'd asked her, are we supposed to report in? And they say, well, wouldn't hurt. Because generally you don't do that. You just knock on the door and say, sir, you want to see me? Or sir, whatever. There's protocol and professionalism, but it's not like super structured where you're saluting everyone. So I went in, I reported in, and I said, good morning, sir, Second Lieutenant Scott Daniel Spring reporting his order, sir. And he kind of looked stunned. He said, wow, I can't remember the last time I had someone salute me like that. So anyway, that was kind of funny, but he was a good guy. This is just, I don't remember. This is just a picture. I don't have very many pictures. This is a picture of when I was in my camouflage stuff. Usually we wore our blues. We wore, a blue shirt and blue slacks, but sometimes we'd wear camouflage, and so this was what we'd wear on occasion, and so that's a picture of that. This is where I lived in Utah. I'm trying to remember. This is a picture of when I was being promoted from first lieutenant to second lieutenant. And that's I had it backwards. I almost said that's my wife. That's not my wife. This is my wife. This was my commander of my 20th Intel Squadron. And of course, I'm drawing a blank at the moment. Colonel Albert. He's a lieutenant colonel. But I think he was my boss's boss. So this previous one, it was my boss's boss's boss. This I'm a little higher up, so this was just my boss's boss. But so that was kind of cool. Not too many other pictures. There was one time, no, this isn't the picture, but this is a picture, just a humorous thing. This was the part of our chemical warfare gear we had to have with us when we were on a mobility team. We were supposed to have this chemical warfare gear that we were supposed to carry with us. So or not all the time, but we were supposed to, well, actually, yeah, we had this big bag about this big, and our chem warfare gear was, and a couple other items. We're supposed to have like one change of uniform in or something like that. We were supposed to carry it with us, and so I carried that in my blazer whenever I was anywhere. Fortunately, never had to have it, but occasionally they do a practice recall on us, but even then they'd give us a warning, say, we're not going to tell you when, but you might get called tonight for a recall notice, so just be aware. So then we'd always be like, okay, when's it coming? When's the call coming? Because when you were called, you had like 30 minutes to report to base, and you're supposed to be in uniform, and you're supposed to have your mobility bag, and you're supposed to have everything. So you always had everything extra, made sure it was all there, because you didn't want to be missing something because you get written up for that. But this this was just part of that. So I don't remember why I had it on. It was just a humorous thing. One other time when my wife and I bought a house in the shed in the back, one summer there was a huge hornet's nest out there, and it was in there kind of a place where you had to go inside of it to get to it, and I was wanting to kill them and was kind of worried about it because I didn't really want to get stung multiple times. So I put on my chemical warfare gear from head to toe. I was completely covered, gloves and everything, and the thing, and I went out there with a spray thing, and I just sprayed the stew out of those things. I killed them all, and didn't have to worry about getting stung. It was probably a little bit of overkill, but that was the only time I really needed my chemical warfare suit. So. Oh, and then I had a couple other pictures here I brought. This is a picture of when I went to Squadron Officer School. Squadron Officer School is like your first professional officer school you can take in the Air Force. They had 3 levels. Squadron Officer School was for company grade officers at captain, and then there's a thing called Air Command and Staff College, which I never went to because it was for lieutenant colonels, and then there's a thing called Air War College for full colonels. So I never went to those because I didn't get that high, but this was Squadron Officer School, and all these people in it were all fellow captains, or they had a few civilian equivalents. This young lady, I don't remember too much. It's been 15 years. She was a civilian, but she was in the civilian portion, an Air Force civilian. And then this guy was from Saudi Arabia, I think. So he was in the Saudi Air Force, and you could tell that he wasn't in the U.S. Air Force because of his beard, which we were not allowed to have. So anyway, that's me right there. These are all people that I was with for 4 weeks, and interesting time. And then another photo I have here is when I was an instructor in Air Force ROTC in Lincoln. And once a year, you'd have a picture taken with the entire cadet and officer or military staff. So this kind of got bunged up here, but this is a picture of our entire group. So that was our secretary, and here's one of our enlisted people. And there was another enlisted person. I don't know if he was there, but that's me there. And these two are officers, and that was our commander, and then the rest of these were all cadets. So there are about 6 of us that were not in college, and the rest of these were all college students. So that was a fun time. This was indoors at the indoor practice facility there that we took our pictures of. So.
Did you make any close friendships while in service?
You know, I had close friends when I was there. I'm not a super extroverted type of person that keeps close tabs on a lot of people. It's not because I don't like them. I'm not good at that. So I keep close friendships with my family and a couple other people, but I'm not, that's just, hate to say it, sound cliche, but that's not who I am. So there are some good people I spend a lot of time with and really enjoy being around them, but I don't really keep up. I've kind of occasionally kept in touch with a couple people, and now it's a little bit easier with, well, I'm not on Facebook, but LinkedIn. I've communicated with a couple people via that, but I was not in like a lot of people that are enlisted, you know, they go through boot camp and then they're in a platoon or a company with someone for 3 years, and they're living in barracks with them, so they're with them almost as much as somebody might be with a spouse. I was never with anyone really close like that, so it wasn't a situation where I really got close to people in that type of environment.
Did you keep a personal diary?
No, I never really did. I was just never really thought of anything, doing something like that, so nope.
Do you recall the day your service ended?
Yeah, I remember it not super well, but I was an ROTC instructor, and actually classes were over for the year, so this was summer. I think this was in June of 2001, early June. I don't remember the exact day, but classes were already over for the year so students were already gone, and you know, we were doing some stuff kind of up until the end. Every couple of years they'd have a thing called an IAG inspection, an Inspector General inspection, and that's where some staff from headquarters would come in and do a thorough check of everything you do, and they'd look through all the paperwork and all of your records and all that stuff. And so it was kind of a big deal because they'd give an award. They'd have like 3 levels, and you wanted to always get that. Outstanding was the top level you could get. Excellent was second best, and then like satisfactory was the last one, but you didn't want to get satisfactory. That even though it said satisfactory, it was like it's not satisfactory. So you certainly wanted to get at least excellent, but everyone always wanted outstanding, so you're always trying to get all that. Anyway, we were kind of coming up right on the end of that, and we just got done with this IG inspection, and I think we got an excellent. So I mean, we did a good job, but then that was over, and then that was right about when I was done, and so it's kind of a frantic rush to get all that stuff done, and then kind of had a little bit of time to breathe. But it wasn't anything super big deal, just because I was at a small unit, so we didn't have a big ceremony where someone was done. And I was a captain. It wasn't like I was a colonel that had been in for 25, 30 years and have a big retirement ceremony. So I think my last day, we were all there, and my boss asked where I wanted to go for my going away luncheon, and I think I said Famous Dave's in Lincoln. So we all went to Famous Dave's for lunch, and I got a couple cards from people, and my boss told me I appreciated my work, and that was about it. So
what did you do in your days and weeks afterward?
well, I had basically already had a job lined up. Towards the end there, I knew I was going to be getting out, and so I think I took a couple days of leave here and there. I've been sending out resumes to employers, and had interviewed with a couple places, and one of the places offered me a job, and I asked if I could have they wanted me to start right away, but I said, I'm just getting on active duty on this day. Can I have a week? Because my wife wanted to go visit her sister for a couple days, and it was a lot. We had two little boys at the time. I couldn't remember when one was born. And they said, okay. So I had about a week and a half between my last day in the Air Force before I started my new job. So just kind of doing a few things around the house. Went and visited my wife's sister and her family for a couple of days, and then then I started my new job. So.
Was your education supported by the GI Bill?
No, but it was supported in a different way. When I went through our OTC, I had applied for a scholarship when I was in high school, and I got selected for a scholarship. So most of my college was paid for, not all of it, but most of it. And then when I got on active duty, I had no desire ever to go to school again, but I was in a spot that was coded a technical field, and so because of that, once you're on active duty, it's not under the GI Bill, but you can get tuition assistance on classes if you're working on classes that kind of are in your area. I don't know that you could take any class. I don't remember. Anyway, you could take classes, but then the Air Force would pay for 75% of it, but then you would have to pay for the other 25%, and you'd have to pay for the books. Well, because I was in the position I was in, they were paying for 100% of it, and they were paying for the books. So I didn't have to pay anything out of pocket. So I really didn't want to go back to school, but I knew if I wanted to stay in the Air Force and stay as an officer, if you want to get promoted to major, you really should have your master's degree. So I wasn't sure if I was going to stay in long term or not, but I didn't want to box myself in by not working towards my master. So I started my master's degree just 9 months after I graduated, so much quicker than I thought. But I ended up getting my master's degree. I paid for a little bit of it at the end because I wasn't sure if I was going to stay in or not. But I was not eligible for the GI Bill because I had already gotten paid for so much other stuff.
Did you join a veterans organization?
No, I didn't. I haven't. That's probably something I should have looked into. I know a couple of them I'm not eligible for because I didn't serve overseas or serve in a time of combat or conflict, but I know there's a couple that I probably could do. I just never really taken the time to pursue it. It's probably something I should, though.
Do you attend reunions?
Well, the units I was in, they aren't really the kind that you have reunions. We had a lot of turnover, people, and it was a different situation. I wasn't attached to a battalion or a regiment or a company for 3 years. And so it's not a type of thing where you have you'd normally have reunions. So, that's one thing I kind of wish I would have had in the military because I was an Air Force officer and the positions I was in, they weren't that type. My first assignment in Utah, I was attached to the 640th Munition Squadron, but I wasn't in the 640th Munition Squadron. So there's nothing there. And then the 20th Intel Squadron at Offutt, I wasn't there super long, and I wasn't an Intel officer, and they probably don't even have reunions for that sort of thing either. So,
what did you go on to do as a career after the war? Or after your service?
After my service, I was an engineer for about, 12 years. I worked for a company down in Beatrice for about a year and a half, and then they moved all their operations to North Carolina, so my job went away, and so I was trying to find a job here in Nebraska and couldn't find anything. I ended up going to work for a competitor of that company's in the Chicago area, and then I was there for about 7 years, had another job in Illinois. So I was there for about 10 years, and then my dad was getting ready to retire from farming or slow down, so he wanted to know if I wanted to come back and farm. And so I came back and have been farming with him for the last 6-7 years.
Did your military experience influence your thinking about the military in general?
I don't know, not really. Everything that I'd kind of thought of the military for the most part was kind of reaffirmed while I was in the military. I think we always think in the military as like above reproach or can't make any mistakes, and you kind of learn quickly that people in the military are human just like everybody else, and they definitely make mistakes. But I always appreciated most of the people that are in the military were they're normal persons. They all have their own desires and wishes, but everyone for the most part was wanting to do a good job and worked hard and really wanted to work well together. And you're always going to have conflicts with people regardless. And so, it wasn't something like here's civilian life and it's chaos and here's military and everything's perfect. It wasn't anything like that. You see a lot of the same type of thing in both, but I just always appreciated most of the people in the military were wanting to work hard and do a good job and serve their country and work as part of a team. So, and I found that to be true for the most part. So.
Is there anything you'd like to add that we have not covered in this interview?
Not really. Just that I really am thankful for my time in the service. Sometimes I kind of wish I would have stayed in. I don't regret getting out because of my family not having to move around a lot, but I did enjoy the military, and I'm very thankful for those that have made the commitment. Some people, it's easy to make a commitment for 30 years and do that, and some people it's hard, and I think it would have been hard for me to do that for 30 years, not doing the work itself, but my family's pretty close-knit, and we don't like to move around a lot and be close to our family, and I think that would have been a little bit difficult. But I appreciate the people that are willing to make that sacrifice, and certainly those that are willing to sacrifice, be in combat and be away from their families for 6 months, a year or more at a time. And there's a lot of people that really, truly aren't rewarded for just how much they've truly had to deal with in their lives. And I always feel a little bit, not embarrassed, but I had it pretty easy in the military. I didn't suffer very much. And so there's a lot of people that have really gone through a lot. And I wish and hope there's some way we can really recognize those people and appreciate them for what they've done. So.